London in the mid-19th century was a stage set for a grandiose play, where each act was strictly regulated, and the finale of life became the most expensive production. A heavy, oily fog hung over the city, which seemed to absorb the sounds of hooves and the cries of street vendors, leaving only a viscous silence. On one such gray Tuesday, two figures stood motionless at the massive doors of a mansion in Mayfair. They stood still, like statues carved from obsidian. They wore long black cloaks, top hats adorned with deep silk ribbons, and snow-white gloves that seemed dazzling against the backdrop of the general mourning. In their hands, they held long staffs covered in black fabric. These people uttered not a single word. They were not relatives of the deceased, nor were they his friends. And they didn't even know his name until this morning. They were professional mute mourners, or, as they were called in the Victorian era, mutes. Their job was to embody grief itself, transforming a private loss into a magnificent spectacle visible to every passerby. For this silence, for this immobility, and for this impeccable black attire, they were paid money, turning silence into the most expensive commodity in the funeral services market. In those days, a person's social status was determined not only by how they lived, but also by how grand the end of their earthly journey was. The public display of life's conclusion became a crucial attribute of prestige. If gloomy men with staffs didn't stand at the door of the house, neighbors might suspect the family of financial insolvency or, worse still, of a lack of proper respect for the ancestors' memory. This was an era when feelings had to be materialized, showcased, and strictly regulated. Society demanded visual proof of grief, and if family members were too exhausted by shock to observe all formalities, professionals came to their aid. Thus, an entire industry was born where silence was worth more than gold, and facial expressions had a clearly established tariff. Every fold in the mute's cloak, every inclination of his head was calculated and paid for according to a price list, creating the illusion of inconsolable sorrow where sometimes only cold calculation reigned. The reasons for the emergence of such a specific profession are rooted in the distant past, but it was in the mid-19th century that they reached their peak. The need for mutes arose from the desire to bring order to the chaos that inevitably accompanies the news of the end of life. In Victorian society, there was a strict code of conduct, and spontaneous displays of emotion were considered a sign of bad taste. The professional mourner served as a kind of buffer between the intimate world of the family and the curious gaze of the street. He created a solemn barrier, signaling to the world that something sacred and inviolable was happening behind those doors. Moreover, the presence of such hired workers solved a purely aesthetic problem. The procession had to look impressive. If there were few relatives, the mutes filled the void, creating the illusion of a huge crowd of admirers seeing a person off on their last journey. This was the architecture of social recognition, where living people served as columns supporting the edifice of family pride. The outer layer of this conflict of interest between reality and appearance lay in the fierce competition among funeral homes. In the mid-19th century, the undertaking business became one of the most profitable and aggressive industries. Each bureau strove to surpass its competitors in the lavishness of the inventory offered. Agency owners waged a real war for the right to be considered the most sorrowful service providers. Mutes were living billboards for these companies. Their clothes had to be not just black, but the deepest shade of soot without a single lint or stain. The fabric of the cloaks was chosen in such a way that it would not reflect light, absorbing it and creating an aura of melancholy around the figure. Any wardrobe malfunction, be it a crumpled collar or a stale ribbon on a hat, could destroy the entire atmosphere and inflict irreparable damage on the reputation not only of the family, but also of the bureau itself. Agents monitored the market with paranoid meticulousness. If a competitor appeared with mutes in new gloves of the finest leather, the next day, another bureau was obliged to offer an even more exquisite option. Competition reached absurd levels. Bureau owners hired special agents who stood guard outside doctors' houses to be the first to learn of a wealthy patient's critical condition. As soon as a possible end of life became known, bureau representatives, ready to offer the services of their mutes, were dispatched to the house. Advertising brochures of the time indicated the number of horses, the height of the ostrich feathers on the hearse, and, of course, the number of professional silent witnesses. Middle-class families, wishing to appear richer, went into debt to hire at least 2 mutes, as the absence of these figures at the door was considered a disgrace. The external conflict here manifested itself in constant societal pressure. It was necessary to conform to a standard that became more complex and expensive with each passing decade. Funerals turned into a competition of budgets, where the number of hired silent witnesses directly indicated the family's weight in the city's social hierarchy. Funeral home owners created entire catalogs of expressions that mutes were expected to reproduce. There was quiet sorrow, deep despondency, and solemn humility. Each payment level corresponded to a specific degree of expressiveness. If a bureau supplied a mute who accidentally yawned or looked at a passerby with interest, it was considered a breach of contract, resulting in huge fines. The outside world saw only motionless figures, but behind this facade lay a brutal industry of control, where every gesture was a commodity. Funeral agents even debated which height of mute evoked greater public respect, and often selected pairs of identical height and build to achieve absolute symmetry at the entrance to the house. This aesthetic dictatorship demanded inhuman endurance from the performers. However, behind this solemn facade lay a deep internal conflict of the performers themselves. The work of a mute required incredible discipline and psychological endurance, often bordering on self-abnegation. Imagine a man named Thomas, a typical representative of this class. In ordinary life, Thomas might have been a dock worker or a carpenter's apprentice, whose life consisted of struggling for every piece of bread. But twice a week, he would put on a clean shirt, tie a black tie, and turn into a silent shadow. A contradiction raged within him. He was portraying grief for a man who owned half the block, while his own children might not have seen meat for several weeks. Standing in the cold wind, chilling him to the bone through the thin fabric of his state-issued cloak, Thomas was obliged to maintain a mask of deep sorrow. He was forbidden even to shift his feet, so as not to disturb the symmetry of the scene observed by the deceased's neighbors. For people like Thomas, every workday was a test of the professional mask's strength. He stood at the doors of a house that smelled of expensive wood and wax, feeling only emptiness in his stomach. The psychological burden was colossal. A person became a living decorative element, deprived of the right to their own opinion, voice, or even physiological reactions. If a dog ran past or a street quarrel occurred, the mute had no right to turn their head. They were obliged to stare at a single point, symbolizing eternity, while their thoughts might have been occupied with how to pay the rent for their kennel in the East End slums. This internal chasm between personality and function created a special atmosphere of alienation. Often, after the ceremony, these symbols of sorrow would head to the nearest cheap pub to relieve the tension. There, in clouds of tobacco smoke, they transformed into ordinary laborers, sometimes joking crudely about those they had just solemnly escorted. But as long as the top hat was on, they belonged not to themselves, but to the ritual. There was also a moral dilemma. Many mutes were despised in their own communities. Neighbors saw them as people who profited from others' loss, without feeling an ounce of sympathy. This bred a sense of isolation. For the rich, they were just part of the furniture, and for the poor, they were traders who donned master's attire to stand at the threshold of someone else's prosperity. The internal conflict intensified when a mute had to stand at the house of a person who, in life, was known for their cruelty or greed. Maintaining an expression of reverence for such a person was a professional feat, requiring complete suppression of one's own feelings. The person was literally split in two, into a physical shell performing a role and a hidden personality full of indignation or indifference. On an ideological and philosophical level, the existence of professional mourners exposed a fundamental paradox of human culture of that time. It was a clash between genuine feeling and ritual, between a living soul and a social mechanism. Society believed that ritual could and should replace feeling if the latter was not expressive or convenient enough. Victorian philosophy was built on the idea of total control over nature and emotions. By hiring a mute, people tried to tame the element of loss, to confine it within the bounds of propriety and aesthetics. It was an attempt to prove that even in the face of eternity, a person could maintain dignity and order. But in this attempt lay a deep irony. By replacing living grief with a theatrical performance, people deprived the moment of life's end of its natural simplicity. The clash between the idea of being and the idea of seeming ran like a red thread through the entire mourning industry. The professional mourner became the physical embodiment of this substitution, a symbol that public opinion had become more important than personal experience. The philosophical conflict lay in the question, can sincerity be bought? Victorians answered in the affirmative, believing that a purchased form generates the desired content. If the ceremony looks magnificent, then the memory of the person will also be magnificent. However, this logic began to falter over time. The intellectual elite of the time began to wonder, does the presence of hired silent mourners not insult the very essence of farewell? Does the sacred moment not turn into a farce, where the main roles are played by random people for a few shillings a day? This struggle of ideas between traditional formalism and the nascent striving for authenticity gradually undermined the foundations of the profession. The transformation of this established order began unexpectedly and was caused by a complex of factors that changed the face of Europe. In the late 19th century, industrialization and the rapid pace of life began to come into sharp conflict with the slow and lavish rituals of the past. People began to realize that excessive spending on theatrical processions was not only ruinous, but also meaningless in a world where time began to be valued more than gold. A powerful movement for simple funerals emerged, whose supporters argued that true respect for memory does not require hired actors. The turning point was a change in public consciousness. Sincerity began to be valued higher than adherence to formalities. Suddenly, what had seemed magnificent for decades began to look ridiculous, cumbersome, and even vulgar. The silent figures at the door of the house began to be perceived not as guardians of memory, but as an anachronism hindering a true farewell. Scientific discoveries also served as a peculiar catalyst for change. The development of medicine and sanitation changed attitudes towards the end of life, making it a less mystical and more biological process. As people began to understand more about the causes of diseases, the aura of mystery surrounding the end of the earthly journey began to dissipate. The ritual, which previously served as protection from the unknown, began to seem like an unnecessary embellishment. Moreover, the economic crises of the late century forced even the aristocracy to reconsider their expenses. Maintaining an army of mutes, paying for their immaculate cloaks and top hats, became increasingly difficult. Gradually, families began to abandon the services of silent witnesses, preferring to spend funds on more practical needs or on charity in memory of the deceased. The culmination of this process occurred during the great social upheavals of the early 20th century, when large-scale global events brought about an understanding of the true value of human life. Petty concerns about prestige and the number of staves at the coffin finally faded into the background. The profession of the mute disappeared almost overnight, swept away by the wave of a new reality. This was not just the dismissal of a group of specific workers. It was the collapse of an entire philosophy of perceiving the end of the journey. The culmination was a complete reformatting of the funeral industry. The focus shifted from external pomp to psychological support and convenience for loved ones. Hired silent witnesses, whose services cost a fortune, became unnecessary in a world that demanded truth, speed, and simplicity. The last representatives of this profession lived out their days in obscurity, remembering times when their immobility was a guarantee of family honor. But now their stories evoked only a puzzled smile from the new generation. This moment of truth exposed all the hypocrisy of the old system. It turned out that the world did not collapse when people in black stopped standing at the doors. On the contrary, the farewell process became more intimate and humane. The culmination of the mute's story is the triumph of reality over imitation. All those thousands of pounds spent on silk ribbons and silent standing proved to be just dust in the winds of history. Society outgrew its need for paid decorations, realizing that dignity cannot be bought with shillings, and silence at the coffin is valuable only when it is filled with personal memories, not the professional composure of a hired worker. The collapse of the profession became the final chord in the long symphony of Victorian pretense. The resonance of this story reaches us even today, making us ponder how often we substitute form for substance in our daily lives. The history of professional mourners is not just a curiosity from the distant past. It is a mirror reflecting the eternal human desire to appear better in the eyes of others, even in the most difficult and responsible moments. The lesson here is simple yet profound. No hired silence and no impeccably black silk can replace one sincere sigh. In the modern world, where social media often becomes a showcase for our achievements and experiences, we risk turning into similar digital mutes, displaying edited emotions and carefully constructed frames for the approval of an invisible crowd. We continue to pay for silence and prestige, only now the currency and tools of control have changed. The principles of the Victorian era remind us of the importance of returning to authenticity, to each person's right to weakness, and to experience their losses without regard for neighbors. The resonance of this theme lies in the realization that the industry of imitating feelings will always exist wherever social status is placed above the human soul. By understanding how the mutes of the past worked, we can better recognize the mutes of the present, those who create an appearance of order and well-being where an honest conversation or genuine help is needed. History teaches us that any form devoid of content sooner or later becomes absurd and disappears under the pressure of reality. True respect does not need a costumed entourage. It lives in actions and memories that cannot be bought. Concluding this narrative, we return once again to that foggy London morning where it all began. Two figures in black slowly move away from the house's doors, their shift complete. They remove their gloves, fold their staffs, and disappear into the crowd, instantly becoming invisible among thousands of other city dwellers. The one they had seen off remained in silence, but now it was a true silence, not one bought with money. The profession of a mute has passed, leaving behind only dusty top hats in museums and pages in old books. But the question of where sincere respect ends and theater for the sake of public opinion begins remains open for each of us. After all, ultimately, what matters is not how many people in black stood at the doors or how profound their hired grief was. What matters is only the memory that remained in the hearts of those who, at that moment, were inside the house, behind the tightly drawn curtains. Silence can be golden, but only when it comes from the depths of the soul and is not part of a paid contract. We have come a long way from those hired shadows at the doorstep to a modern understanding of the value of human life. Let this story of people who were paid for silence serve as a reminder. The most important things in the world are priceless, and the loudest silence is the one we keep within ourselves voluntarily. The story of the mutes is complete, but the lesson of their silent presence remains relevant, urging us to value authenticity in every gesture and every word.